Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Well, after that, I'm a bit nervous now. Okay, so what today we're going to look at is really what our oceans are all about. What we certainly recognize as when we think about oceans, certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, are the types of lovely organisms. It's turtle watching season, the leatherback turtles. We have bacon shark if you're any divers, any sort of tourist activities like scuba diving, snorkeling, sailing, all these different types of recreational sorts of activities. Going down in Tobago, glass bottom boat, touring, etc. However, it's not necessarily that nice all the time. You do have a lot of pollution in our waters. Plastics, ghost nets, you have oil pollutions, overfishing, oil spills, all sorts of different things that we certainly know, not necessarily love, but we are very much aware of and in tune with, certainly within the marine environment. These sorts of things have been what had spurned off the World Oceans Day. It's a UN initiative that was established, as Lana had indicated. It is an annual event, June 8th, and to my knowledge, I don't think Trinidad and Tobago have ever really done anything for World Ocean Day, and this initiative from the Marine Sciences at UTT, to my knowledge, at the very least, is one of the first. Throughout the year, UTT and the Marine Sciences have been initiating several different types of talks. We've had a mobile marine awareness program that has been running for a year, 2 years now, actually. Currently this week, we're also holding a mini mantas camp, which is a marine science camp for 8 to 12-year-olds. And we're also having a marine showcase in August. So we've been quite busy, and as you can notice, World Oceans Day is June 8th. We're a little bit past that. And it's because it's been so hectic and so busy. However, every day for us as marine science people are World Oceans Day. So I hope you will enjoy the presentation somewhat. I would like to actually start off the lecture back in New York, in the Bronx Zoo, when we had the first discovered the initiation of the West Nile virus. This was in the Bronx Zoo, where a lot of birds were dying off, and one of the vets had noticed as well and put together that you had, about a month later, a lot of humans were now having a lot of flu-like symptoms. They didn't really think necessarily too much of that. However, as time progressed, you were having not just birds, but also mammals that were being affected and were dying, and they had put it down to this West Nile virus, which was transmitted and is transmitted by mosquitoes. From that, you had the jump from animals into humans, and that was certainly documented. And to tell you how fast this was moving, in 2001, you had about 150 odd cases in terms of infections in humans and up to 18 deaths. And in 1 year's time, that had gone into over 4,000 cases of infections and almost 300 cases of known fatalities. So that's quite a lot. Within this West Nile virus, and the extent of it, of course, human life is of huge importance. And just in that time frame with the West Nile virus, it had cost over $200 million US. So in terms of for help to control and healthcare for individuals that were infected. But it's really more than just the West Nile virus. Several outbreaks have been documented throughout the years, as early as the 1900s, when you've had the avian influenza, running all the way to the more recent Ebola hemorrhagic fever. Each of these types of diseases have jumped from an animal into humans. And of course, it's something that's going to be of concern to us. And from a lot of these initiatives, it was, well, certainly something has to happen. If we are catching a lot of diseases from marine animals or from any animals for that matter, there needs to be a lot more collaboration between disciplines. The health science persons who deal with humans need to be interacting with what's going on with the veterinary sciences, and they need to be dealing with what's happening in terms of the environment and what's causing a lot of these jumps and shifts and capabilities of these viruses to jump different hosts. But we're really here to look at oceans and why we fit in. I consider myself an ocean gal. So with respect to this, where do we fit in? Oceans are extremely important for our environment. It has provision of food resources. It provides a lot of oxygen. It has a huge impact in terms of our climate. And it's, as Lana had indicated, massive for our cultural and recreational opportunities. Within this, we do have a heavy input with regards to fisheries, and as such, a lot of this presentation will wrap around as a fisheries initiative in terms of as examples. Now, in terms of fishing, there's several opportunities in terms of why we would love to have a healthy ocean, which in turn will have healthy fish and fish resources. Fish are extremely important for providing nutrients and as grazers for our environments. They are the top predators, fish and mammals both, within our marine environment. And what they tend to do in terms of for a reef environment, they are the lawn keepers, so to speak. They keep that balance. They are the herbivores. They keep that balance between overgrowth and being overrun, so all the different animals, like corals, would be able to survive. You also have, they provide a huge basis for the world economy. Just for the US alone, they provide over $5 billion worth in revenue. You have provision of food resources. 44% of the global population lives on the coast, and a lot of those, and the majority of that, they're heavy resources in terms of food resources, in terms of seafood. They eat a lot of seafood. It's also for part of the economy is that you would have a lot of tourism activities, recreational, scuba diving, snorkeling, all these different types of things, sailing, etc., that will also bring money and revenue into different areas. And of course, one of my launching sorts of pet areas is biotechnology. The marine environment is certainly becoming more and more sought after in terms of the types of organisms, because there are a lot of extracts that are taken from marine animals like sponges and corals, as well as a variety of fish and algae and different types of plants that have been utilized in the pharmaceutical industry for different types of drugs. And there's a bit of that we'll talk about later on in the presentation. So after all of these greatness, we do have some major issues. In terms of fishing, there are 5 major different types of groups when we're talking about fishing and fishing activities. These are the demersal fish, the bottom-dwelling fish, pelagic, that lives within the water column, crustaceans, which tend to be on the very bottom of the ocean floor, which will include like crab, lobster, and krill and shrimp. You would have different mollusks, the types of snails and cephalopods, which would be squid, octopus, and cuttlefish, that are heavily utilized and fed upon, certainly within the Asian countries. And of course, the marine mammals, whales, dolphins, porpoises, all of which are hunted for their meat as well as their oils. So from here, you have the first two, the demersal and the pelagic, that provide the majority of harvest effort. So 72 million tons per year are taken between the demersal and the pelagic fisheries. You have about 10 odd million tons per year across the rest of the different groups in what we have. So actually there's quite a lot of effort in terms of the fisheries when it comes to demersal and pelagic, which will also stand to reason that there are a lot of issues when it comes to overharvesting and certainly exploitation. From various studies that have been done, it has been estimated on a global level that approximately 100 million tons in terms of harvest effort is where is estimated to be sustainable yield. At present, we are currently on, again, this is on a global scale, harvesting about 100 million tons per year as well. This means that we are at our sustainable limit. And with that being said, with human populations on the rise and continue to be on a rise, it will mean that if we stick to that sustainable level, then we will also end up having certain circumstances where you will end up having too few fish, which will end up being something where prices will be skyrocketing for that. Just to give a brief example, some of you may be aware of the Peruvian anchovy fishery. Within this, it used to be a thriving fishery, certainly prior to the 1950s and all the way through to the 60s. This is where they started from around 86,000 tons per year, all the way through to into the millions, to almost 10 million tons per year that they used to harvest. Where it really helped Peru out in terms of their fishery was that, or one of the reasons at the very least, is that you had these meals, prepackaged meals, and the fishery extracts that you would have that would be given as supplements in the pharmaceutical companies and even for plants and in agriculture, that they would utilize the anchovies, which is one of the main fisheries. It wasn't the only thing they used to catch, but it certainly was one of the key types of fishery that they used to go after. So within a relatively short period of time, that's 1960s by the way, the Norwegian and Icelandic herring fishery collapsed. And with this, it meant that they were actually getting, in terms of Peru, taking advantage of that collapse and were therefore exporting even more. And from that, a lot of warning bells went off in terms of the scientists that were attached to the government and in their fisheries. And they indicated that if they don't put a stop to the amount of their fisheries, it will end up collapsing. But because they were making a lot of money, it really didn't make any difference to the government. On top of which, a couple years later, in the early 1970s, we had several bad years when it came to climatic changes. We had a long El Nino year, and with that, the anchovy fishery collapsed because it was heavily tied with the temperatures of the water within that environment. So what did they do? They just shifted to the sardine industry. And that was quite successful for a few years. And after that, there was a different climatic change in terms of the water temperatures. Sardines didn't seem to be so lucrative, so they went back into the anchovies, which had since started some level of recovery. But after that, it was pretty much decimated. And unfortunately for Peru, they are yet to recover from this decline of their fisheries. It's not a unique story. It's happened in California, it's happened in Japan, and for different types of fisheries, you would have where you would go in with these very long bursts of you exploit your fisheries, and you will eventually pass your sustainable yield. It'll collapse that particular fishery, and then either it will recover after subsequent years, sometimes it's after 30 odd years, or sometimes it doesn't at all. We see certainly that various fisheries have been certainly exploited. If you look in this table at the peak years, we're way past these peak years in terms of where we can take advantage of some of these different fisheries. Beyond which, what's really interesting to note is that the majority of them are over 70% overfished and overexploited. We have had a history in terms of our global history. We've had a history of not learning our lessons. We exploit and overexploit one particular species, and then we say, oops, okay, then we'll move on to something else, and then move on to something else, and move on to something else. Which means to say that several of our species, not just demersal or pelagic, but even our crustaceans as well, have been heavily affected, and in certain species have been decimated almost to the point of extinction. From that, and what has contributed certainly is not just climatic changes, but also from technology and the increase and improvement of technology. So us as humans, when we have gone in and developed faster boats, better propellers, better technologies, better types of nets and recovery of nets. And that has had and caused an increase in our fishing efforts. And with an increase in our fishing efforts, for a shorter period of time, you can take more fish, or crustaceans or shrimp or whatever the fisheries is. And that takes a huge toll on the existing populations. Certainly here in Trinidad and Tobago, we really don't have a very good handle in terms of what is our sustainable rates like in terms of extraction from our waters. But we do know across the Caribbean that we have 40% decline within our fisheries as a whole. And this is from the last 20-odd years. Within our wild stock, about 55% of the commercially harvested fisheries are overexploited or partially exploited, and 40% are completely and fully exploited. This meant that over $100 million was spent importing fish into the Caribbean, which is $100 million that could have been utilized as a revenue that we could have gained in the export of fisheries, perhaps. On the larger level, we have 44%, as I mentioned, of persons in the coastal area that are there, and it has the majority of food that comes from there. And you would have 60% of fish that is consumed by the developing world. So which means that a lot of the small island states, such as Trinidad and Tobago, should be and is heavily tied to our fisheries and our fishing industry. So fisheries is certainly something that we need to pay attention to and to give a lot of effort to as well. You have just in Asia alone over 1 billion people that have unutilized fish and fish products as their primary source of protein. That is a huge deal if you end up having your resource as your main food resource as fish, and there may be issues with that fish that you're eating, you're going down a very slippery slope. Positive news, though, is that the fishing industry employs millions, hundreds of millions of persons on an annual basis, which means that there is a market, there is an economy, and there is revenue from the fisheries as a whole. Beyond fisheries, we also have issues with the water chemistry as a whole. There's something that has been, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but there's a new movement in terms of research within the marine sciences where it's ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is sometimes referred to as the other carbon dioxide problem and other carbon dioxide issue. Long story short, increasing of carbon dioxide has increase of carbonic acid in a marine or any aquatic environment. With an increase of carbonic acid, as in anything else, you get more and more acid, it means that you would get more and more acidic. With greater and greater acidity, you will end up with various systems being affected. Certainly off the bat, you would have issues with biomineralization, which is a fancy term for creating of shells and skeletons and anything that requires calcium carbonate. You would also have changes, and has been recorded changes of their behavior, as well as within their reproduction and their reproductive success. There is a clear link between increase of carbon dioxide with a decrease of your pH, which means that an increase of your acidity. What we have seen and mapped is that you have areas that have and show high levels of traffic in terms of shipping activity. You would have a lot of SOxes and NOxes. These are things like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, etc. And a lot of those trade routes are along coastal areas. Along those coastal areas, you have had and have recorded increases in pH in terms of greater acidity in the nearshore coastal areas. And with that, you've had several issues that have started happening. Just as a basic chemistry, somewhat of a lesson, the equation for the what's happening with increasing of carbon dioxide. So what you have is you have atmospheric carbon dioxide that dissolves in the water, and with that forms the carbonic acid. With carbonic acid, it dissociates, and it goes all the way down to availability of carbonate ions. This carbonate ion is what is utilized for the production of shells, etc. The balance between net dissolution and calcification is what is of interest to us. If it is that the acidity causes greater dissolution, it means then that organisms that rely on the environment to extract carbonate for the formation of shells and their skeletons are going to have a problem, because then it's going to be harder and harder for them to actually absorb carbon dioxide, the calcium carbonate. If it is that the pH is high enough, it means that it's more basic, that the carbonate ion is going to be the predominant sort of ion, so it'll be relatively easy for organisms to then extract the carbonate into their structures, so that'll be very good for them. You would have, besides shells, the skeletons. Water as a whole dissociates into hydrogen ions and oxygen. These hydrogen ions have a very high affinity for the carbonate ions, and therefore it will, think of it like two magnets that are just going to pull and be attracted to one another. But long story short, the more acid or acidic the aquatic environment is, whether it's freshwater, whether it's marine, the less available carbonate ions are for shells, etc., which means that organisms have to expend a lot more energy. So who cares, right? Well, part of this is that for our protection within our coastal environment, we need things like coral reefs. Corals have a huge, their skeletons are based on calcium carbonate, and with greater acidification, you would have very structural and density issues with the deposition of the skeleton when it comes to not just corals, but that's the one that I'm using for now. So what you would end up having with increase of acidity, and the harder it is for carbonate to actually be precipitated and utilized, corals, as well as other organisms, struggle to hold on to the integrity and the thickness of their skeletons. They tend to be thinner, and they tend to be more brittle as well. That means then that it's easy to erode. Fish can erode it, sponges can erode it. There's a whole host of other organisms that can break the corals, inclusive of just wave energy as well. With the destruction of the coral reef environment in terms of their skeleton, it also means that our coastlines become more vulnerable to coastal storms, etc. You would have that corals become more stressed. They are expending a lot more energy in just forming their skeletons. If they're expending more energy with these sorts of physiological processes, it'll mean that a lot less energy is being used for their own protection against different bacteria, viruses, funguses, etc. So they tend to be more prone to diseases. They also become more stressed. With that stress, you would have greater bleaching episodes, and bleaching is a stress response for coral, and with extensive bleaching you can also have yet another route for killing these particular organisms. It has been recorded that fewer larval forms of the coral are surviving with greater acidity, and with that, all in all, you would have loss of habitat and loss of diversity and genetic diversity, and certainly loss of ecological resilience. And again, this is quite important in terms of protection of our coastlines. Coral reefs are known to be the nursery habitats for a lot of the fisheries, inclusive of conch, in terms of the back reef areas, and supporting and protecting of seagrass bed areas. And with that, you also have, as I mentioned before, the rich areas where a lot of products are utilized for the biomedical fields. So we've had lots of evidence in our marine environment to show that, sorry, I keep pressing that with my finger. We've had a lot of evidence to show that several organisms in our reef environment are heavily impacted by greater and greater acidity. This means to say that a lot of the integrity of our marine environment and the functioning of our marine environment is being affected as well. Something a little bit further away from home is the Great Barrier Reef. A lot of studies are being conducted when it comes to calcification of corals. And over the last few years, they have noticed a decline in the health of their reefs and certainly the rugosity of their reefs as well. Now, when we compare the Pacific coral reefs and the Great Barrier Reef to the Caribbean reefs, there is a huge difference between the numbers of species that we would find. In the Caribbean, we have about 25 to 28 odd species, genera of hard corals, of corals in the Caribbean, and there are hundreds in the Pacific. And up until recently, most persons would say, oh, our reefs are rubbish, they're dying, the people are abusing them, they're being walked on, etc., etc. But our reefs are seeming to be more and more apparent that they're a little bit more resilient than we had thought. Now we are seeing in the Great Barrier Reef, which is touted as very pristine, etc., very well managed, that they are having a lot of issues with diseases, with their corals dying as well. And a lot of this is coming down to environmental changes, climatic changes, acidified waters, etc. It's more than just corals, though. Going back onto the fisheries, ocean acidification has also affected tuna. Studies have shown that it has increased mortality of both adults and very much so on the larval organisms as well. It has shown to have genetic changes, and they have had, in terms of the larval forms, changes in their growth rate, their survivability, their cellular and skeletal integrity, as well as their air bones or their otoliths in terms of their deformity. All of these things go towards and lean towards the success of the surviving of those larval forms into an adult. Besides tuna, studies have been done on sharks. Sharks have also been known to be affected by increasing acidity in our marine environment. With that, sharks have been exposed to an acidic environment for a particular point in time, and then they would done an experiment in terms of odor detection. For shark survivability, odor is one of their key functions for identifying where their potential next meal is and their prey. With that, if they have something that's affecting their ability and their capability to detect their next meal, that is going to be a huge issue when it comes to their success as an organism. What they found was two major things. One, that they were not able to successfully detect odors of their potential prey. And then two, they had very altered swimming patterns, particularly at night. For sharks and basic shark biology, sharks continuously have to move in order to get oxygen through their gills. However, in conditions where you have higher acidity, you would find that they stop moving or they are moving continuously all the time, and they're not stopping. So when they are sleeping, they stop, and then they wiggle, they stop, then they wiggle. By constantly wiggling, they're utilizing a lot of energy, so they're really not getting a lot of rest in that sense. And it has contributed, again, to different behaviors for their success as hunters and predators. Cobia, which is another type of fish, which is also one that is quite successful in terms of aquaculture, have also had investigations done, and again, their otoliths have been affected. They are unable to properly disperse, and their recruitment efforts are therefore being affected. You would have a lot of issues with navigation, finding their way around, and instead of avoiding predators, you would have certain species that will actually be attracted to their predators. So instead of getting and swimming away from the big bad shark, etc., they will end up actually swimming towards it and become a very easy meal. Their hearing, their vision, everything is being affected just from increasing the acidity of the water. But again, that's a little bit further away from home. So when we talk about conch, the queen conch, everybody knows, I suspect, about who and what the queen conch is. And with that, it is a huge industry within the Caribbean. We make almost 90 million US just from the conch fisheries from the Caribbean as a whole. It's been touted that Tobago is the stock for the rest of the Caribbean, which means that our stock within Tobago is of great importance to the rest of the Caribbean and their success in terms of the economy. You would notice as well that very similar to the or part of the fishing and the fishing industry, you would have more than 12,000 individuals that are employed in one way, whether full-time or part-time, in this particular fishery. But with the story of ocean acidification, it has been already had potential impact on the particular fisheries, at least as noted in Jamaica. You have softer shells, smaller shells that are coming on, that are being harvested. It's a very well-managed fishery in Pedro Bank, in just off of Jamaica. And they would find that studies that have been shown, initial studies have shown, again, issues with the larval forms and their survivability. The shells are much weaker. Other types of mollusks like bivalves, the oysters, have hinges that are being affected as well. And with that means that they have greater predators. Predators have a greater chance of success of eating those particular organisms. There has been an increase in landings, but you would also find that there's a decrease in terms of how much price you're going to get if you have smaller shells, fewer shells, and in terms of the meat that's being collected. What has been indicated, although there has been no formal study, was that within the fisheries for Jamaica, there's a 12-week period where persons gain more than 50% of their annual income from the conch fisheries. From that, if there is a collapse or decline in terms of the conch and the availability of conch and the value of the meat that they're obtaining from the conch, it would then drive these individuals to other employ. That sounds easy enough. However, based on the ground observations, it meant that mothers, young girls, young boys were being used in prostitution in order to raise their income to meet their needs for that year. So the collapse of the conch industry, certainly for Jamaica, is a huge, huge issue. Something that we have seen in the papers in terms of sonic booms, the seismic testing, the paper touted as the seismic bombings. This is something that has been utilized a lot, and it's been originating from our cetaceans, the whales and dolphins. There's been a high number of mass stranding events, and this is along the globe, not just for Trinidad and Tobago. And these mass stranding events have been connected to a mid to high frequency sonar use. And a lot of this tends to give a lot of disorientation. You also find there's been documentation of what's called bubble lesions on these particular organisms that they have attributed to be very similar to decompression sickness, which is something that you would get with air bubbles in your blood if you're a diver and you come up too fast, and nitrogen comes out of your blood, and it can cause an embolism in humans. So you or we as humans who use seismic technology and sonar technology have the potential to certainly damage and impact the cetacean populations. Within that, we also have marine invasive species. Marine invasives are basically organisms that don't truly belong into your particular environment. Of more recent note, you would have heard of the lionfish. Have anybody here heard of the lionfish and lionfish? Anybody raise their hands? Don't be shy. I know you're freezing. All right. So It's a very beautiful fish, correct. But a lot of invasives generally has been attributed to trade and shipping trade at the very least. So the image that you would see here is looking at, for within our region, shipping trade for the Caribbean. And with that, we've had examples of the green mussel. The green mussel, or Perna viridis, was an invasive species back in the 90s, and it started off where first observations were around 1990 in Trinidad and Tobago, and had spent over the next 10, 15 years circulating around the Caribbean. If you notice on the graph, on the very bottom, you would see this particular region here where you have heavy trade that's going on. You'd also see that you have heavy infestation along the same lines. Of course, this could be supposition as well, because we'll have to test the ballast water within ships, etc., for these things. But shipping water and ballast water that are used within the for vessels and stabilization of vessels have had issues and continue to have issues with transportation of exotics within their water. Besides the green mussels, which we have since utilized as a food resource, of course, you also have the lionfish. Again, across 10-year time span, you would have one particular location of sightings, which is off of Florida, and throughout the years, that become an infestation throughout the Caribbean. Of course, again, we've utilized this as a food resource. And it's something that we as humans have capitalized. Besides food, they are now being utilized in the jewelry industry. So you would have various things. I've got a student who's investigating the use of jewelry when it comes to lionfish. But certainly it's still an issue when it comes to our local fisheries, because these fish are, they eat out and are very voracious when it comes to the other fish around them, which means that our local fisheries is now being impacted by having these particular fish in our waters. I'm sure most of you will be aware of the sargassum issue that we're experiencing. This is not the first time our beaches and our waters have had sargassum coming up on them. The first major notice that we've had was back in 2011. And the sargassum, there are two particular species, sargassum natans and fluitans. And these two particular species originating from the Sargasso Sea. The little map in the middle shows the location of the Sargasso Sea. And we have had, I guess the lights are not here, very conducive. But right within here, you would see, if you can, you would have the circulation patterns that surround the Sargasso Sea. From within that, we've noticed, certainly off the coast of Barbados, where a lot more of the studies have been done when it comes to sargassum, where you have mats more than a quarter-mile wide. And you've had mats coming up on the beaches more than 3 meters high as well. It has been that's pretty much almost as tall as me. You've had also people trying to figure out what's going on. Why do we have sargassum coming into our waters? It's not 100% known, but there are different reasons that have been put forward. One of the first ones is changes in circulation. There's a group out in Florida, in the US, coming out of Texas, that are looking at water circulation patterns. And what they have in terms of their preliminary investigations have shown that there have been some minor changes to the eddy patterns of the currents that that the Sargasso Sea is exposed to. And with that, you've had movements coming from the sargassum. Certainly the majority of it would have gone up towards Florida, the Carolinas. But now with those minor changes, and especially as it's coming into the ones that are moving a little bit more southward, that's where we are, or why we are starting perhaps to see a lot of the sargassum coming up on our shores. You also have persons that have indicated changes in our water temperatures, which is actually linked back to our currents, because our currents are, as I said, our oceans are very important when it comes to our climate. It's important, and it's linked to the winds, and with our winds, certainly with our currents as well. So if we have changes in our temperature, which has a knock-on effect and changes of our circulation and our currents and our oceans, it's no wonder that we're seeing changes in terms of where different organisms are ending up. Potentially, there's also been, and this has not, to my knowledge, at least been investigated on a molecular level, on a genetic level, but there have been touted in terms of a potential that the seaweed may not actually be originating from the Sargasso Sea, but be coming up from another alternate source, which has not been identified. But these are suggestions that have been made throughout the Caribbean for trying to explain why the sargassum, the seaweed, is there. But we do know sargassum has been utilized. It is certainly within, it's an organism that, it's a plant that is very much natural to the marine environment. It's utilized as a nursery area for small fish. It's utilized as food for different organisms. But for us as persons, as individuals, we've also utilized them as fertilizers as well as additives to our food and drink. Pretty much everything in our environment, we as people try to figure out a way to ingest it in one form or another. In terms of the fertilizers, you do have a lot of small businesses that have come out of the sargassum from the seaweed. And within this, it's a little bit labor intensive, but they're able to utilize it, and it's a very rich source of nutrients for the environment. But it's also not so good. You would have because you have various fisheries like tuna, wahoo, dolphin, and even turtles that are attracted to the sargassum for feeding, fishermen have utilized this to try and locate different pods of fish in order to go out and harvest and exploit that occurrence. You have another student who had indications of butterfly fish coming up and leaving. Butterfly fish are known to be very small reef fish that tends to be very close to the corals, but they are traveling up through the water column to feed on the sargassum as well, which makes it more vulnerable to predation. You have a lot of organisms being trapped in the sargassum. Across the Manzanilla stretch, we've had indications of turtle hatchlings being trapped and can't get out. We've had indications of even adult organisms being caught up in the sargassum and tangled up in it, and subsequently drowning as well. Just recently, I've also been told that some efforts have been made, again in the Manzanilla stretch, that they're taking a tractor and literally clearing the sargassum off of the beach. While this may be a good thing for some persons, it's indications have also been shown, and again, there's been no scientific study of this, but persons' observations, that the sargassum have also contributed perhaps to protection of erosion of those particular stretches. So there's a good thing and a bad thing, and which do you want to save? Do you want to save the turtles, or do you want to save your beach for the next time around for other turtles as well? It's not a very easy thing to manage, but certainly it's something I think that deems and cries out for research and for study when it comes to our marine environment. Some other key issues when we're talking about bioavailability, bioaccumulation, concentration, and magnification. This pretty much all comes up to what is in our environment and how does it get through and up the food chain and the food web, and does that have an effect on us as people that are consuming them? When we talk about bioavailability, we look at what may be in the environment that the fish that we are harvesting are in. There are certain indications, and those fish that are caught around harbors and oil industries, so it's not necessarily on a coastal, but where you have extractions occurring in our marine environment, that you would have a lot of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, fancy term for something not so pleasant, that are very high in quantities, that have a huge impact on us and our abilities for our physiology to be successful. You would have polycyclical biophenols, the PCBs, DDTs. These are all things that have been since banned for use in the environment, but are still present in our marine environment, in our sediments. And as we go in and we dredge, we're dredging up all of these sorts of chemicals, and it gets into the water column. Different organisms will be swimming in there. They'll be eating the sediments in the case of shrimp, for example, and then that's something that we will ultimately ingest. So when we're looking at accumulation, certainly of things like heavy metals, you will end up showing that there has been, and there's scientific evidence to show that what's in your environment and what these organisms are feeding on is getting into the plants. The plants are taking this up. They're doing what they do best, taking up nutrients, taking up things around them. And when you have fish eating the plants, and then more fish eating that fish, and then ultimately we're eating that fish, whatever they have ate, we're taking in as well. So we are also ingesting these heavy metals, whether we know it or not. In terms of the case of PCBs, as an example, this is something that has been known to affect pups, seal pups, in European countries. And you have had the ban of PCP, as I mentioned. This ban had occurred in the very late 70s. However, up till today, in more recent times, we're still seeing the impacts and the effect of PCB within the environment. PCB has been used, certainly within the shipping industry, quite heavily. And as you know, in Europe, there was a huge shipping the huge shipping countries, and with that you've had a huge fallout from the downfalls of PCBs in your environment. They had these seals, they had a population of more than 3,000, and in a very short space of time this has declined to less than 500. In terms of harbor seals, you had more than 16,000 harbor seals and 200 gray seals, and their populations are almost wiped out within those particular areas across the Danish island. Part of the issue and/or problem is that PCP had affected their immune systems, which made them more prone to canine distemper, and within that had cause of death. Closer to home in terms of in a human state, I warn you now, there may be a bit of a nasty little picture. Within this, back in the 1960s, Minamata, Japan has been very well documented and very well known to be a huge case when it comes to infection and bioaccumulation of heavy metals, in this case of mercury. Minamata is a very small fishing town in Japan, and they had a plastics industry that used to dump a lot of their waste into their bay. It's a fishing town, and whatever's in the bay is going to end up in the fisheries. And within that, you would end up in a few short space of time that you would have a lot of the adults coming out with gnarled limbs. You would have the babies that are dying as well. It affected the nervous system, and they tried it on, and they did a lot of tests on various organisms such as cats, etc. And they showed this very similar traits, all from mercury poisoning. And this today, where now this the industry has since been banned. However, 40 odd years later, we're still finding children being born with effects coming out from the mercury poisoning from before. This is quite massive. It means to say that mercury is something that we certainly need to be paying attention to from what's in our environment, whether it's our marine environment or not. What we do know, and some studies have shown that in the US market when it came to fisheries, that they had levels of extremely high levels of mercury found in the fish being sold in their markets. I'm not sure if you can see it very quite clearly. However, the top two in terms of fisheries, so within these two, shark is the second one that showed the highest. How much mercury is in the shark meat within our environment, that to my knowledge has not been, at least not released, but I'm hoping that someone is doing those studies. Besides that, there are evidence of turtles, persons who like to eat turtles. It's something that we've done culturally through Trinidad and Tobago. It's something that we've certainly been trying to, certain people have been trying to put a limit on. But we have had indications of arsenic in the muscle, in the kidneys, in the liver. So we do know there are a lot of organisms in our environment that have shown that these things are appearing in their muscles, and the muscle is what we're eating. Which means to say that we need to pay a little bit more attention to what is in the marine environment and ultimately getting into the organisms that we're eating, because that's going to have a potential effect on us as individuals. Shark, again, is something of particular interest. Their tissues have been, they are very, very good about storing mercury. And with that means that we have the potential to have huge issues when it comes to shark consumption within our country. Moving on from that depressing state is another depressing state is with coral reefs. Throughout the Caribbean and the tropical zone overall, but certainly within the Caribbean, has been known as an area, as it's called a hotspot. It's a hotspot for environmental change, and it's certainly a hotspot for diseases. Since 1970 to present, we've had a massive increase in terms of both prevalence as well as virulence of diseases for our corals. And this is something that has been unprecedented in our geological history. We've had massive changes and changeovers of the types of species that we're observing within our record, and this is within the Caribbean as well. And we're also seeing higher levels of diseases in shellfish. You would have black spot diseases that affects oysters. You would have lobsters, crabs, etc. being affected. You would have an increase in the number of tumors. My students are seeing some turtles with the papillomavirus, the tumors that you would have even in Chagoramus. You would have lesions that are being formed, and you would have a lot of unknowns. Back in 1984-85, there was a huge die-off of the sea urchins, the long-spine sea urchins, which are keystone species within a reef environment. They are another herbivore. They are the ones that tend to keep down the fleshy algae in our coral reefs. And with their huge die-off, it meant that a lot of our reefs died from smothering of algae. We don't know what caused that die-off. We suspect it's a virus of some kind, but the studies have not shown anything conclusive with that. Even the urchins have been showing to have tumors and or growths of some kind that we don't know the origin for. But we do know that these organisms are extremely important to us as people. I did mention that these organisms are heavily utilized in the pharmaceutical industry. Both the sponges, which are the porifera, and corals, which are under the cnidaria, are the primary source of extract materials that have been utilized for different sorts of chemicals, things that are going towards anti-cancer, anti-cardio, antiviral, antibiotics, and all these different things. And with that, you would find the terpenoids, the alkaloids, and the steroids are three of the most important extracts in what you would find from these particular organisms. A lot of times you would tend to have these extracts as being very lucrative for the biotechnological industry, partly because that these organisms are in an aquatic environment, one, and that means that any sort of defense mechanisms that these animals would need to have need to be extremely powerful, quite potent, so they're not diluted when they are in effect. You'd also find a lot of these extracts are peptide-based, and that has shown to be, in terms of the peptide-based extracts, extremely important for things that are antibacterial in nature. We've had just a few types of categories of things that have been utilized from our marine environment that have gone all the way from treatment of pain all the way through to helping to affect the HIV virus. Much more simply, you would have the calcium carbonate that have been in the skeletons of the corals that have successfully been integrated into the biomedical fields. And within this, they have been used to substitute for bone grafts, etc. Beyond that is certainly our need to be able to preserve and protect these particular organisms, and of course the habitats that go along with that, because we have such few organisms that have already been targeted in the biotechnological field. And from those few organisms, we've had tens of thousands of potential marine natural products that have been extracted, few of which that have gone through the trials, because it takes 30 plus years in order to go from the identification of the actual extraction to the potential that they could have had in the medical field. So if it is that we have impacted our environment in such a way that their habitats or the organisms themselves are overexploited and or destroyed, then we potentially then lose the capacity to extract these important compounds that we can utilize for our own benefits. Which means to say that the effects and the impacts that aquaculture can play for the longevity of these particular species, certainly as they are utilized for the pharmaceutical industry, is going to be an important part. What it is that we need to target is something that we need to explore across as many organisms as is possible. Right now, it is a drop in the bucket, a drop in the sea certainly, where we have in terms of the types of organisms that have been utilized, the majority of which has been sponges. Merck is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, and they have actually invested in the Caribbean, in Costa Rica, and within there they have been going out and harvesting from their marine environment. The danger, of course, is that they overharvest these particular organisms in order to find that one lucrative extract for their company. We do know, though, because of the potency of the extracts and the potency of the venom that are used and the properties that these organisms utilize, that we do have the potential to have similar sorts of potency in terms of its effect as it's utilized within that particular compound. Altogether, though, hopefully you would get a picture that we as individuals, as humans, contribute and put things within our environment. Organisms that are living in our environment are utilizing those sorts of chemicals, etc., within there. And then through general normal steps of nature, it comes right back to haunt us. So every time we throw something into the drains, eventually that could come back through our stomachs and or our skins. Where in our water, you can get infections from air infections, nose infections, throat infections, rashes. You can get problems in terms of your digestion, etc. That can be not so nice, I can assure you. But this understanding and the linkage between the environment, organisms, whether plant or animal-based, the linkage between the environment, animals, and us as humans is critical and or crucial. In more recent times, there's been an initiative that's called the One Health Initiative. This is really paying attention to that linkage. It no longer sees the environment, the organisms, and humans as separate entities, but that in order to properly investigate us as humans and diseases, etc., that we are experiencing, we need to be a little bit more intimate with what's going on in the environment as well as what's happening with these organisms. So we've gone from separate disciplines in terms of environment, plants and animals, and certainly human studies. And the move is now going towards morphing all three to the point where everything is interconnected and has an interface. So our health is connected to certainly what we eat, be it plant or animal based. The health of the animals is going to be based on the environment and the health of the environment. And that healthy environment is something that we can impact and or affect as well. So this triad is something that is moving more and more within, at least that we're trying to move that towards a consciousness within the sciences. A couple of years ago, Vet School UE had hosted the first One Health workshop in Trinidad, and subsequently from that, there's a movement certainly to look at diseases, invasives, and try to integrate different disciplines in order to try and solve and or attack various problems. Coming out of the One Health initiative, and they have come up with basically 12 principles in order to live by. Now, coming out from where the One Health initiative began, a lot of it was focused on diseases of animals and diseases of humans. However, it goes beyond just diseases. It's basically all health of your environment, health of organisms, plant or animal based, and certainly health of us as humans. Of these 12, you would have the need and the recognition of this link, the essential link between those three entities in order to maintain a healthy and functioning ecosystem and environment, which ultimately is going to mean that we as humans are going to be healthy as well. It also recognizes that whatever we do, the actions that we have on our environment has real implications to us. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but at one point in time, it is something that will manifest itself that may be to our detriment. Wildlife health is something is of critical importance, certainly when it comes to human health. So the drives for veterinary science and the linkages that they're identifying in terms of the types of diseases that they're seeing and the reasons for those diseases perhaps, and the etiology of those pathogens are going to be critical and important. For that, they need to be a bigger thrust towards us who may be interested in our marine environment and organism diseases, as well as linking that to what is going on in the medical field. So we need to be able to talk to one another a lot better. Persons who work in the environment also need to be connected into this triad again, because they're seeing a lot of these differences. They may not know what diseases may be occurring, but a lot of times the linkages could be just a casual observation that could be the make or break for understanding how a disease works. You also have the understanding and the recognition that health programs, and it's talking about human health, that can greatly contribute to conservation of wildlife, of our marine environment in particular as well. The adage of, you could save them in order to save me, sorts of ideology is something certainly that can be something that can be touted. As again, whatever's happening in your environment ultimately is going to have an effect on us as people. You also need to be able to be adaptive, holistic, and forward-thinking. Within this, it's important to know that, again, what happens today doesn't necessarily manifest itself until a few years down the line. I deliberately didn't talk about oil spills today and the effects of oil spills. However, it has been known, and certainly researched and documented that effects of oil spills, the vapor of the oil, even the vapor of the additives that have in the past been used, that they have had genetic effects on us as humans. And once you have genetic effects, it means that this is something that can carry on in our children and our children's children. And that has certainly been a huge concern for public health scientists and doctors. We need to ensure that we are protecting and conserving our biodiversity and the habitats of organisms. Part of that is that if we can have a healthy organism to start with as potential food resources for us, then we're at least starting off in the right foot, or certainly the right meal for that. We'd also need to be able to regulate our international wildlife and bushmeat trade. How does this even have anything to do with oceans? Is that certainly when we're looking at our environment, and I'm thinking when we're looking at harvesting of whales, dolphins, turtles, and various organisms, a lot of times we're very quick to cull a lot of these organisms if we have seen and or noticed populations, certainly whether they're cattle, just generally speaking now, where we would just kill off a large part of that population if it was that there was a disease. Think of mad cow disease, for example, that had happened a few years ago. These mass culling events that have occurred aren't necessarily the right thing to do. It's a reaction that we would naturally want to have. We want to destroy the causative agent, but it is something that we potentially can actually let loose into the environment if it's not done in the right way. So it's important that persons are present to regulate those sorts of efforts, because again, what gets out in the environment is going to continue to be an exacerbated problem. We also want to ensure that these mass culling events, that they occur with as much information as is possible from as many different disciplines as is possible as well. We want to ensure that we invest in ourselves and in the environment, as well as the biodiversity and the habitats around us. And we want to invest in the infrastructure. We want to ensure that, again, these habitats are adequate for persons, and we also need to ensure that any sort of movement, whether it's going to affect us, whether it's going to affect the environment and or the organisms living within it, that whatever is being done is being looked at in a long-term sort of a fashion. Because without this long-term changes and or goals that we would set, we will do something today that we're going to regret tomorrow, and we see this time and time again. We need to ensure that there's better collaboration as well. With this collaboration, again, knowing what's happening in the fisheries, for example, and how that may be impacting our human health. How many studies have we had locally in terms of the oysters that we eat on the side of the highway, or the fish that we consume, or the shrimp that we consume, even the shark or the catfish, and depending on who you're listening to, whatever they're eating, how much carcinogens they may have, how many heavy metals they would have, how much mercury are you ingesting? How many people within this audience today actually eat fish and or seafood? Raise of hands. We eat a lot of fish. You eat? Okay. How much do you think that you're eating in terms of heavy metals, oil products, byproducts?
Well, the problem is that we go out and catch our own fish with hook.
Mm-hmm.
But we only catch small fish. And in my opinion, the small fish don't have as much heavy metals and stuff like that compared to the big one, because it goes up the chain. But I noticed that the fish has changed. In the late 1960s, we used to go out right in the Gulf from San Fernando, go there and catch a lot of sharks. You cannot catch a shark anymore. There isn't any. What we're catching is what they call cutlass fish. And it's on top there, it has replaced the shark, because this is a very fast moving fish with big teeth, right? And sometimes you're out in the sea and you see these fish are actually jumping and going. So what you're talking about, things are changing. We are catching too much of one species, and so
Yeah.
I can identify with what, very much what you're saying.
Yeah, because I certainly know in terms of the sharks, for example, that they have had issues, certainly in Tobago. It came back to us, there was a meeting for integrated coastal zone management in 2010, and there were persons that had indicated, for example, that there were illegal fishing going on and had decimated. There was a hammerhead population that was a huge draw for scuba divers, and in one fell swoop that was all removed from these fishers. And fisheries was unaware of what was going on. And we're quite shocked to hear that our hammerhead shark populations were being affected in such heavy numbers, certainly in Tobago. And it's something that, again, has been noticed. You would talk to the fishermen, you would talk to the different sites, and they talk about, in some cases that they don't actually catch, as you indicated, shark in our waters. Sometimes they actually buy sharks offshore and bring it in on their vessels. But we are still catching some sharks. There are certain sites that are still somewhat lucrative in terms of poundage and tonnage of sharks coming in. But it's not necessarily meant to say that it's a thriving population. When you go out into the fish markets, more and more you're finding much smaller and smaller sharks, and smaller fish in general that you're finding. And again, this is something that we've noticed across the years as well. And it's because we don't have, in my opinion, I'm not a fisheries biologist certainly, but in my opinion that we need to certainly manage our fisheries a lot better. And when we say we need to manage, it's not just us in Trinidad and Tobago, but as a Caribbean management, we need to have better Caribbean management of the fisheries efforts. But again, we go across geopolitical boundaries, and by doing that, you end up facing a lot more challenges for that as well. In terms of, just wanted to finish that, we just need to ensure that we do have the resources and the support and for education and awareness, which is what a lot of this comes from. So again, if we are aware there are certain times of the year, for example, where certain things may not be as nice to eat, or what is happening in there, then we can actually raise more questions. And I have never really heard of Joe Public really asking about, what is the nutritive value. I know there's a move, for example, to even want to eat lionfish, but how nutrition, how is their nutrition base compared to something else? Is it better, perhaps, than some of the other species that we are consuming? What is the caloric value? What can we gain from there? What are the materials? What are the metals and things? Are they clean for us to even consume, etc.? We have never really even dealt with those sorts of questions, and it's something that I think now we can move towards.